Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Hopefully you've had your English scone, or scone, as some people like to call it, ready for today's event. And this is a bright blue event in partnership with the People's Postcode Lottery called A Needy State, Getting the Relationship Right Between Government and Charities. And it's not only just you watching, we've also got people watching on the live stream, wherever they may be, on a beach somewhere. We're all jealous of that. So hello to you, and you are able to ask questions through the Slido link, which is at the bottom of your YouTube video. And then bright blue members of staff will send your questions to me, so please do send them in. But I will be prioritising people in the room because, of course, they have come to the event. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we are an independent centre-right think tank that seeks to defend and improve liberal society. We work across 5 main research themes: economic policy, employment policy, education policy, energy and environment policy, and social policy. And in the 10 years of being in existence, we've seen over 90 original Bright Blue policies adopted by successive governments, including now a Labour government. And we launched a new strategic plan earlier this year, and one of our aims, alongside helping to lead and shape a new centre-right, is to moderate a Labour government. And what we mean by that is for them to deliver some of their policy aims in a way which is less status, a bit more respectful of individual and community rights and responsibilities, which feeds nicely into what we're going to be discussing today. So Conservatives have always believed very strongly in those intermediary institutions between the state and the individual. The church, charities, civic society generally. And really what we want to discuss today is how has the nature and size of the charitable sector changed in recent years, particularly since the pandemic, when it had to do a huge amount of heavy lifting. And then, of course, since we've had a Labour government come to power and the employers' national insurance rise has gone up, what's been the impact on charities of that and of the general state of economy that we are now in? And then we also want to think about charities as providers of public services when they're commissioned to deliver public services. How effective are they? And really, what's the benefits over charity provision compared to state provision of key services? And then, of course, controversially, it was a big controversial thing during the last Conservative government, which is if charities are receiving a lot of government funding, should they be really campaigning against government policy? Or actually, is the voice of charities very important to telling politicians what's going on the ground? The Labour government have launched a new civil society covenant framework, so perhaps some of the speakers will reflect on what that means and what the implications are for that. And then also, let's think about the funding models for charities as well. So government has obviously become a very big funder, but how can they diversify and innovate their funding? And in particular for the People's Postcode Lottery, what impact will the gambling levy have on charity funding and the lives of the most vulnerable? So please do tweet. So if you have got a phone and you want to amplify some of the arguments coming from the room, then please use our hashtag #BrightBlue and CPC25, and our Twitter handles are WeAreBrightBlue and Postcode Lottery. Each speaker is going to be speaking for about 4 minutes. So we'll start with Joe Robertson, MP, who is the PPS to the Shadow Culture, Media and Sport team. On my near right, we have Lindsay MacDonald. Do you know, because you have stepped in, I was like, I've got to remember her name, and I did. So that's great. And Lindsay is the CEO of Magic Breakfast. And then we have, to my far right, Nick Cook, who is the head of UK Public Affairs at People's Postcode Lottery, and also the director of the Lotteries Council. We were going to have Polly Toynbee I think we frightened her away because obviously she's from The Guardian and it's a Conservative conference. But no, she unfortunately wasn't able to make it and sends her apologies. So, getting the relationship right. Joe, over to you first.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ryan. Great to be here. As Ryan said, I am PPS to the Shadow Culture, Media and Sport team, and of course charities come under DCMS. I also used to work for a charity, so I'm a solicitor by background, by training, by profession, but I joined Dementia UK for 6 years prior to being elected to Parliament. Charities have a long tradition in this country, going back hundreds of years, in delivering for people, delivering services, tackling issues of health, relieving poverty, long before the state did anything meaningful in those areas and others. Sometimes, I think, as Conservatives, we are a little shy and a little reticent to be strong in the space of charities. Again, alongside health, it's probably one of a few issues we sort of resign ourselves to a view, which is incorrect, but a view out there that this is not really a Conservative area. This is something the sort of Labour Party perform better on and talk more about. That's incorrect, and I don't think we should shy away from our record on supporting charities. Charities deliver emergency services in the case of the lifeboat, and of course, you've already mentioned, the Church of England have been delivering in all sorts of ways over hundreds of years. What I would like to see from a future Conservative government is relieving the pressure on charities, starting with reversing some of the things that this Labour government have done. The Chancellor at the last budget obviously increased national insurance contributions across the board, but she recognised this would cause pressure and would cause harm within the delivery of healthcare, because that's why she exempted the NHS. But delivery of healthcare and the NHS are not two interchangeable, simultaneous terms, because there are a lot of charities out there that deliver healthcare and are not the NHS. But she didn't relieve the pressure of the NIC's hike on charities. And for a lot of charities, they don't operate with a contract with government, with any government funding at all. So while it may not have been intended as a pressure point on charities, that was the outcome of the national insurance increases without relieving the pressure that the NHS received. So I would like us to recognise as a party, we already do, but I want to see more of it. Charities aren't merely there to fill in the gaps and mop up where the state is ineffective. They are a fundamental long-term part of the way our society operates, and the relationship between government and charities is a really, really important one. And just to address that point around should charities be expressing opinions around government policy, what shouldn't be happening is that charities feel unable to express a view because they receive government funding, whereas those that don't receive government funding can express a view. I think it's perfectly acceptable for charities, and a lot of charities have a huge amount of expertise, and some of them specifically gather data and information in order to influence policy and government decision making. I think it's absolutely right that they can express a view about government policy. That is very different from being political or party political, which they shouldn't be. We shouldn't think that is a vague or difficult line to police, because it happens across the board. You can criticise government policy, opposition policy, without being party political. And provided that line isn't crossed, I'm very relaxed about charities receiving government money, whether we're in government or not. and having a view about government policy.
Great, thank you, Joe. Very, very interesting. So, I think, after the very big defeat that the Tories faced in '97, there's a feeling of, we need to revisit first principles and a new philosophy, and that's similarly what Kemi has tried to do since the 2024 election, which was similarly very disastrous for the Tories. And after that, there was this whole concept of civic conservatism, which David Willits, who was former Universities Minister, wrote a book about. And he basically, in the noughties, it was under Thatcher in the 80s, individualism had become the kind of central guiding philosophy. And then under New Labour, we had statism. So actually, we needed something in between that, and we needed the big society. So the big society was born, and Cameron really pushed for that. And as part of that, it was thinking about how community groups can set up and run public service organisations, like free schools, for example. There was a really big push around social investment, so thinking about how charities could change their funding models so that they could be in receipt of investor funding and deliver returns to those investors, albeit probably not at the same rate as other enterprises can do, but had a kind of social mission around it. But then the big society seemed to have sort of dissipated and got lost. A lot of people said, well, it was just a cover for deficit reduction, or deficit reduction took over as the primary aim. Do you think there is a need to kind of refine that big society agenda now the Conservatives are in opposition again? And what would that look like? How would it be different to the sort of Cameron big society agenda?
I think probably the biggest problem that the Cameron big society agenda faced was the term the big society. It didn't land as well as I think Cameron hoped, and people struggled to understand the concept. But absolutely the concept is still as valid as it ever was. I would say more so. I think probably another negative sort of connotation that comes around it is this idea that the state can withdraw and leave it to others to pick up. That's not what the big society is about, but there was certainly, not necessarily for political reasons, but concern from opponents that was what it amounted to, because it came at a time of austerity, right? So it was about trying to reduce the deficit, reduce government spending, and the big society could just take over, which means like all you lot just sort it out. I mean that wasn't what it was about, but that was why I think it never really took off in the way it should have done, and it needs to be relaunched and repackaged. But I wouldn't really look for interesting phrases or words. People understand what charities do. They know what charity means. They know it's not for profit. They know that it's about doing good, whatever doing good it means to them, depending on the area of interest for them. And also, most people do something charitable themselves, even if it's not formally part of a charity. Non-profit organisations, informal community groups. So I take an example, and sorry again to go back to sort of health and social care, but it's what I know best in a charity setting. So I'm on the health select committee in the House of Commons, and we did an inquiry into social care, the cost of doing nothing. And we did a inquiry visit, so the committee came to the Isle of Wight to see how acute the problem was, because we have my constituency is Isle of Wight East, to see how the UK would look in 20 years' time, because we have an older population that's about 20 years ahead of the rest of the UK, the acute pressures in social care. And actually the informal conclusion going away is, yes, the Isle of Wight has a bigger challenge in social care because it's got an older age demographic. The Isle of Wight is incredibly good at self-help through local charities, small charities, volunteering, sense of community, sense of looking after your neighbour. And because it's an island community, the problem you've got in social care is actually slightly masked, because you're better than how the UK nationally would deal with looking after your neighbour, small groups. Not necessarily big national charities, sometimes on a very small scale. how you capture this in sort of policy, going back to that big society branding, is very, very difficult. But just because you can't present it in a sort of neatly packaged way very easily doesn't mean that we shouldn't be operating in this space and talking about it. So it goes back to some very, very conservative principles, which is look out for your neighbour, friends, family. It's also deregulated. You know, it's not a command and control status approach. And even where government funding is involved, I guess the biggest challenge to a lot of charities is government funding being very short term. Tends to be short term funding. You don't get that long term sort of guarantee. So you know, everything about charities is you can draw back to core conservative principles.
So it's interesting that you think charities are incredibly conservative, because some criticism is that charities are too left-wing. Lots of people who go into charities are quite left-wing in their outlook, and charities obviously broadly do service provision and advocacy. And in that advocacy, there is an argument that some of it can be quite left-leaning in terms of its outlook. Do you agree with that, and why do you think that is?
Look, I mean, charities will campaign on issues around poverty reduction and health, improving sort of health provision. Again, I guess there are sort of connotations, associations around that being sort of left-wing policy, but I don't really agree. I mean, clearly there's output from charities that is left-leaning in terms of sort of policy that they're pushing, but I don't really accept the premise that charities are somehow sort of left-leaning or left-wing.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Right, Lindsay. So you represent a charity. So very interested in your thoughts on, you know, what's the value add that charities bring, and particularly your charity, and what's that right relationship between you and government?
Thank you all. So I'll give a very brief overview of Magic Breakfast's journey to date, because I think it actually touches on and sets out what charity and government can achieve together. So Magic Breakfast is just over 20 years old, and we were set up because our founder went to several schools in London and heard that some children were doing worse than their better off peers. They weren't achieving the grades that other nearby schools in London were achieving. And she asked the head teachers, why is that? And they consistently said, because they arrive hungry and they're not able to focus on the lessons in the morning. And so the next morning, Carmel went into those schools and had stopped at Tesco, picked up some food, and dropped it off to feed as many of the children as she could at the start of that school day. And that was the beginning of Magic Breakfast. That individual, you know, feeling compelled to act and, you know, take that responsibility and contribute. What Magic Breakfast has gone on to achieve is to expand provision. This morning, about 350,000 children and young people had access to a Magic Breakfast. And our growth is actually in part because of government investment and interest in our work under the coalition and then the Conservative government. So the National School Breakfast Programme, which was an initial pilot of the Magic Breakfast model in schools, the most disadvantaged schools in the country, was in part funded by government and allowed the testing and the evidence to be built up about the impact that providing breakfast at the start of the school day could achieve. And they found that up to 2 months of attainment, catch up in that learning was realised by providing a nutritious breakfast at the start of the day. The evidence that was brought together under that Conservative government has now been picked up and introduced by the Labour government to, expand the provision of breakfast clubs and to see the start of a national rollout in all English, for all English primary aged pupils. So you can see, I suppose, the going back and forth of charity, innovation, philanthropic giving. People's Postcode Lottery and the players of Postcode Lottery have raised and given about £5.5 million unrestricted to Magic Breakfast. And what that has meant is that we've been able to not just deliver consistently for more than 20 years, but to innovate. We navigated the lockdown of schools in partnership with Amazon, who helped us provide stigma-free, barrier-free breakfast by delivering breakfast to children's homes so that they didn't have the stigma of a charity dropping off food. It didn't look like a handout or anything like that. It was an Amazon van delivering breakfast through the lockdown period, and about 35,000 families benefited from that charity corporate partnership relationship. So I think, ultimately there's a role to play for charities, there's a role to play for government, and that's political and unelected officials, the civil service. And I think what you get from charities is innovation, the opportunity to try new things, the opportunity to test and learn, to build up the evidence. And that's why I completely agree that it's right that charities also call out and highlight when a government policy isn't having the impact or the effectiveness that it necessarily could. And that's not from a left or a right-leaning position, but from a position of our vested interests. In the case of Magic Breakfast, our vested interests are those of children and young people. And that's who we advocate and campaign for, and we celebrate achievements, from all governments and all parties, and we call out where they can do better, where they can go faster, where they can go further. And I think what's also really important is all of those partners, and it's ideal when it is a partnership, government and charity, private sector, are honest and open about some of the unintended consequences as things evolve and develop as well. So, a great example is the limited value, for example, of providing school breakfasts if they're not nutritious, if they don't provide improved health outcomes for children and young people as well. So I think there's a value and a power to working in collaboration, and there's a value and a power to speaking openly and honestly with each other, and drawing on the assets. I think a final thing I'd say is that what charities also bring to the table is goodwill. In terms of the partners that we work with, the volunteers. So looking at the charitable workforce as a whole, volunteers outnumber paid employees by about 3 to 1. So just thinking about the contribution to GDP, about 96 billion per year is spent by charities on an annual basis, but you also have the value which is non-financial, goes beyond that. And the sense of community, cohesion, and collective activism, which I think is something the country can really benefit from at the moment.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. So I think a lot of Conservatives think it's really important that people move from a state of dependency because of complex needs that they have at a particular time and receive the support to move to independence. And some people, not saying I say this, but some people would say the business model of charities is slightly concerning because to carry on receiving government funding and donations, they have to prove that there are people in need. But if they're helping people escape need, that's somewhat in conflict. So can you reassure people that that's not happening? There isn't a kind of, well, we've helped all these people, now we need to kind of enlarge what our case is and make up another issue or another need. You see the logic of what I'm saying,
Absolutely.
But interested in what the response is.
Yeah, and I'm going to be really honest about the answer. I think there may be times that does happen, not necessarily intentionally, but because of the collective nature of human beings and the way they behave. We're talking about this very actively at Magic Breakfast at the moment, as you can imagine. The government is stepping in. Their manifesto commitment is about £300 million per year being put into breakfast clubs for primary age children. And if they do that, and if they provide the guidance and the support to enable schools to provide it, then brilliant. I would more than happily put myself and my team ultimately out of jobs. I think that's absolutely the right thing. And I think in the charity sector, there's a very live and rich discussion about navigating that, how to navigate changes and transitioning from higher need to different need, higher need to lower need. And I do go back, not just because I'm sat next to Nick, but because the role of unrestricted funding to allow charities to navigate those changes effectively, because what actually puts pressure on charities to keep going and keep making the case is when you set out a project plan that stipulates how you spend the money for the next 5 years and you're not able to adjust and adapt that, if things change, whether that be improving or just adjusting. So I do think charities take that really seriously. We do want to ultimately find a world, find a vision of where we don't need to exist, especially those that work in the poverty alleviation space. And I think that can be enabled, again, through that open conversation. So having an openness, for example, from government, from political officials to share what they're planning to do and by when allows charities to plan far more effectively than, finding out in, press or not having long-term financial and funding commitments. So I suppose I would implore that there's more cross-party work, especially in these spaces that do rely quite a lot on charities, because ultimately we don't tend to hang on to our cash. We do try and spend it in the best way possible, and navigating uncertainty is something that ultimately reserves are used to achieve. So I think openness and longer-term planning on all fronts would be really valuable.
Do you think the reserves policy that you have in place by law through the Charity Commission is too strict, the amount of reserves that you're meant to have?
So actually the reserves policy and guidance is quite autonomous to the charities themselves. So you need to set out why you have reserves, what the benefit of those is, and then as a board of trustees, they assess and determine what your risk is. So we had a really interesting conversation a couple of years ago with our trustees, which was, what's our biggest single risk? How do we perceive and what lens do we put risk on our reserves? And it was a child in a classroom that's currently, and a family that's relying on that breakfast every day. That's how they know they will get something to eat at the start of the school day, and making sure that we can continue to provide that. So for example, we do 3-year forecasting, both our fundraising and our expenditure, to try and make sure that we can navigate somehow to a place that those children continue to get breakfast, either through Magic Breakfast or through public sector funding. So I think there's quite a lot of flexibility. What becomes more challenging is, again, I go back to funders who tend to put their lens and perspective on what reserves should be. So I've heard everything as a chief executive from you should effectively not have reserves to how do you not have more than 6 months reserves. So I think, again, the conversation probably needs to happen in the funder space around what is a sensible approach to each charity's reserves policy. And that's largely the case, but there are outliers.
Thank you. Great. So Nick, over to you. Interested in how charities can be more innovative in terms of their income and diversifying their income.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. Delighted to be partnering with Bright Blue for the first time since I think we did a virtual event during COVID, which still seems quite bizarre. I think it was my second week in the job and I did it from my kitchen, which wasn't very much fun. For those of you who don't know what People's Postcode Lottery is, it's pretty simple. It's a monthly subscription charity lottery that you sign up, and we manage lotteries on behalf of 127 of Britain's most impactful, if not most well-known charities, some who also operate internationally. We are actually ultimately owned and operated by an international charitable foundation, which is raised more than about £12 billion. So recent analysis showed that we're actually the third biggest non-governmental charity donor in the world, behind the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. And when people see our occasionally, some might say, cheesy advertising, they're not necessarily aware that we have such a broad international impact. So originally founded in the Netherlands by folks who had worked within charities, who were responsible for fundraising for charities, and thought, isn't this process just a bit rubbish? Isn't this a bit restrictive? So the whole model is based around long-term, unrestricted, trust-based funding. And the unrestricted nature of the funding is still more unique than what it should be. So in addition to those 127, I think it's 127, long-term partners, we also offer grant funding to grassroots good causes with turnover of under £1 million. That used to be project-based, flipped that during COVID for obvious reasons, and then never returned to the project-based offering. And we now offer these constituency charities, as we would call them if we're speaking to Joe and his colleagues, multi-year unrestricted funding, which for a grassroots organisation is a real game changer. I want to touch a little bit on some of the points that Joe said and have a bit of a retrospective in terms of the last 5 years, because I think he's right to say that the Conservatives were too shy and too reticent when it came to the charity sector. When I joined People's Postcode Lottery, and I joined it from the Conservative Party, I was a bit concerned it was going to be a cause of the left, and it was going to be working with a bunch of lefties trying to advance a bunch of left-wing causes, which is fine. But I found that actually the opposite was the case when it came to public affairs and it came to dealing with government. And the most vocal champion, particularly of the fundraising sector, if not the charity sector itself, came from within the Conservative Party. So you had people like Tracy Crouch, Stephen Crabb, who I think it's fair to say were on the Cameroonian left of the Conservative Party. But then you also had the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg or Esther McVeigh, who were very much on the right of the party, who became huge advocates for lottery fundraising and the philanthropic sector in general. And that's fundamentally because in the case of our lotteries, we are heavily regulated, and the argument of allowing us to give more to charities is really a deregulatory one. I was going to say a Thatcherite deregulatory one. Some might characterise it that, but fundamentally it's about red tape. And these sales caps that we have prior to 2020 reforms meant that we operated 56 separate siloed charitable trusts. And after the reforms that had no impact on how many tickets we can sell, we can grow commercially as much as we want to, which is fundamental for raising money for charity. We now have 20 trusts, and we have 20 trusts as opposed to 56, and funding can be more flexible because of the Conservative government. And that was a great change, but they didn't grasp it. They didn't grasp the impact and say, we've done this. They didn't think it was they gave the impression, perhaps it is more correct to say, that they didn't always grasp the importance of what they'd done. And their support to charities didn't care who delivered it. They cared that the government had delivered it. And that was a huge win for the sector. And because we've continued to grow, the bureaucracy continues to restrict what we do in the funding space. And if you look at the philanthropic backdrop in the UK just now, the current government should be doing far more in thinking outside the box. £500 million of gift aid goes unclaimed every year of a total of something like 1.6 billion. That's a very simple change. You reform gift aid, you make it easier for people to sign up. That would funnel hundreds of millions to the charity sector. Further reform of our annual sales cap, DCMS itself, as analysis chimes with our internal analysis, we see about 175 million extra to charity. No cost to the exchequer or taxpayers, depending on what your outlook is, who you think the money belongs to. And DCMS says 150 million, but they won't make the change because they're not taking it seriously. It's early days and there's still time, but there's plenty of bandwidth for the Conservatives to continue the support, but also to better champion the success of the changes that they brought forward in government. And if you want to take the traditional view, hold the government's feet to the fire and say, well, we're talking about social justice chaps, and here's something simple that you say could do more for the third sector. We touch a little bit as well, and I want to talk about the free speech element, the campaigning element of charities, because I think it's quite important. If you look at the suite of charities that we fund, everyone in this room will go down the list and say, I think these guys are great, I think these guys are fantastic, and then you'll come across one that you think, I don't much believe in what they do. I don't believe in their cause, I don't believe in their methods, they're too activist, they're too campaigny, I don't like their style. But that doesn't matter from where we are concerned. We think that the Postcode Lottery family, the group, thinks that the world is better with strong social organisations, and it is the principle of civil society and the principle of these organisations having free speech, campaigning for change. It's the principle that is very, very important. And arguably, it's probably a topic for a different fringe, but something that's increasingly under threat. And again, something that I actually think the Conservatives in opposition have begun to look at around the principles of free speech. I haven't quite tied that yet to the importance of civil society, but it is important and it does resonate with people. The number of people who are volunteering in charities is falling, but the people who give money give more. And just because volunteering, apart from some recent figures in Scotland that seem to buck the trend, just because a number of volunteers has fallen now doesn't mean that can and should be accepted. And you go back to COVID and look at everyone, the people who were putting the jabs in your arm in your local sports centre weren't medical professionals. Most of them were volunteers who'd never administered a jag in their life. Jag, whichever you want to call it. But they stepped up, and when there's a cause and when people are encouraged, and it's not necessarily an age or a generational thing, people are willing to help. You just have to make it easy for them. And the sector has a huge role to play, but government also has a role to play on funding, but also in driving engagement. I'm probably going on a little bit, Ryan, but I came of age during the big society period, and you now have the civil society covenant, which to me really just seems like a different version of the same thing. Does it really matter, or is it a statement of intent? I think that's a thorny question. All governments seem to agree with the principle that civil society should do more, but none of them have really unlocked in a holistic way how to make that happen. And that's increasingly a big problem for us, I think.
Great. Thank you, Nick. So it's amazing the amount that People's Postcode Lottery give and the diversity of organisations that you give to. But of course, the money comes from gambling, a form of gambling. And some people on the left are very sceptical of gambling. They feel that it leads to highly addictive behaviour. Some people on the right also worry about that and worry that it's income that is derived purely from chance rather than from effort. So there's some scepticism around it. And we know now that the government is thinking about raising revenue in the next budget, and there's lots of talk about increasing taxes on gambling. So I'm keen for you to talk about your role as an organisation in the sort of gambling sphere and how you're different maybe from, say, remote gambling and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Charity lotteries, society lotteries like ours are regulated by the 2005 Gambling Act. And prior to that act coming into being, we had our own 1976 Act, which was for lotteries and pools and things a bit less exciting than the commercial gaming and betting sector. But one thing government has been good at, and the Gambling Commission for the most part has been good at, is recognising the differentiated risk profile of lotteries as opposed to higher risk commercial gaming and betting, where you can reinvest winnings, you can chase losses. There's a high level of player interaction. So there's a huge body of evidence that recognises the risk profile. But increasingly the picture is patchy, and some of that comes down to the need for government to raise money. Gordon Brown, of course, has floated this idea of the Chancellor raising gambling taxes. And he did mention a specific carve-out for the lottery sector, presumably the National Lottery and Charity Lottery, so in the widest sense, which is something that we hope, therefore, won't impact us. But last year, the Gambling Commission, the government, introduced the gambling levy, and they applied that to everyone, all operators who were regulated by the 2005 Act. Now, we don't pay at the same rate as the commercial gaming and betting sector, But as a proportion of the harm that research says we generate, it is still over and above what the others are having to pay. I mean, speaking with my sort of industry hat on now, one of our member lotteries, the local hospice lottery, which raises about £10 million a year, have forecast the fact that they will have to pay the government's gambling levy is the equivalent to 3,200 hours of funding for hospice care. To me, that is wrong. And if you look across Europe, and comparative research, comparative analysis, I think is very important. A number of countries operate gambling levies, but the lottery sector is exempt. We got the impression that civil servants thought it was too difficult. The National Lottery doesn't pay the levy because they're not regulated by the 2005 Gambling Act, and civil servants thought that would be a little bit tricky. And there is a commitment in the Act that they have to pay something to problem gambling initiatives. I'm not trying to say there's not. But again, as a proportion, it's far lower relative to their sales in income. So the picture is mixed. Looking on a fully UK-wide basis, what I would say is very interesting is that one of our longest-standing supporters of People's Postcode Lottery in particular is Carolyn Harris, who for many years was the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on gambling harm, which has a reputation for being pretty stridently anti-gambling. And she was a huge supporter of ours because she understood the differentiation. IDS, similarly, he's now chair, he was deputy for many years, understood the differentiation. But we also are trying to expand to Northern Ireland to operate UK-wide, because the UK Gambling Act only applies to Great Britain. But politicians in Northern Ireland have a remarkably socially conservative attitude to any sort of gambling, including lotteries, and it is really striking compared to the rest of the British Isles, and that's something that hasn't been encountered for quite a long time. So it certainly is still an issue. I mean, the evidence is pretty strong in terms of our risk profile. People's Postcode Lottery in particular, I think, has to be probably one of the most boring gambling products by design that exists, because you pay to play monthly, have no interaction. Professor Mark Griffiths, who's a very distinguished professor in gambling harms, Nottingham Trent University, actually looked at our games across the 5, soon to be 6 countries that we operate in. And so unexciting were we that he said that we were the safest type of gambling product anywhere in the world. So in some ways that's obviously very positive and it's very safe, but I think you'd be very hard pressed to get any sort of thrill from playing People's Postcode Lottery in the same way people try to interact with commercial gaming and betting.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Okay, let's open it up to questions from the floor. Questions. I was going to say questions or statements, but no, I want questions. So if you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. And please do wait for the microphone. And Will is going to be bringing the microphone round. We need that because we have got people listening on the live stream. And just to remind people, if you're watching on the live stream, if people are there, you can ask questions through the Slido link and they will come to me. So let's start with this gentleman here and then we'll go to this lady here.
Hi, my name's Simon Begbie from Thornbury and Yate constituency, also the Director of Finance, Risk and Compliance for a large UK charity. Questions are, how can the government support charities in 2 ways? One is the amount of red tape in the past 10 years since I've been doing this particular role has increased dramatically, whether that be reporting, whether that be safeguarding, and of course that's very important, but the level of it, is that right? Whether that be banking compliance, very difficult for charities to open bank accounts, even more difficult if you operate internationally, even more difficult if you operate in countries where perhaps it's a little risky. What can the government do to support charities? And on tax, how can the government reduce the tax burden on charities? Because charities do incur VAT when many businesses can, of course, claim it. Charities basically can't. unless you want me to get into partial exemption rules, which I'm sure you don't here. But how can the government support the NI rates? That was a disaster, cost us £80,000 instantaneously. That is not helpful. So what can be done on both in terms of the tax burden and in terms of red tape?
Thank you, Simon. Good questions. This lady here at the front.
Hello, I'm Abigail Gorman. I am the Policy and Research Manager for Sign Health. We are a deaf health charity and we provide support for victims and perpetrators of domestic abuse and also for the wider health issues across the UK as well. Obviously, I work for an organisation that's a charity. I support charities wholeheartedly. We're talking about funding and things like that, and we want to see the impact of that funding. But I think it just remembering that the wider landscape for the economy and the social landscape out there, etc. So we're providing a talking therapist service, domestic abuse service, etc. But that's just one element of these people's lives that we're supporting. We need other organisations to become accessible to the deaf community so that we can work together to provide that sort of support overall. So we're a by and for charity. So our charity provides a service for people, from people for the same community. So it's not just about the funding for charities as a whole, it's making sure that all the charities can work together to become accessible for the community that it serves, essentially. To make sure that funders and commissioners don't ignore us and provide funding to the larger charities that then ultimately have to rely on us to resolve the issue, and it's twice the work for half the money, essentially.
Great, thanks, Abigail. And then a third question from the gentleman right at the back. Stood up.
Thank you very much. I crept in slightly late, so if you've covered this, please feel free to
And could
to
you,
move
sorry
on.
to be rude, could you say who you are?
James Edsberg. I'd like to ask a question about the Procurement Act. In February of this year, the requirement for central government to, in the awarding of its contracts, to contract with private sector companies that deliver social value and partner with the VCSE sector was strengthened. I'd be interested to know whether the panel thinks this is a big jump forward and will bring a strengthening of the relationship between government and the third sector, and what the challenges are around that.
Great, thank you. Three very good questions. So, Joe, I'm going to start with you. Perhaps that last question, actually, which is the sort of Procurement Act and what's taken into account when awarding grants, and whether that's a good thing in terms of social value, be good for charities.
I mean, obviously, it's intended to be. I think where it causes concern, probably more for people of a conservative nature, is the more you have a sort of slightly subjective way of making decisions around procurement and grants and everything else, the more that's a subjective view about what is social value, the more likely you are to bring in bias in decision making, whether intended or not, and the idea that the sort of political preference in awarding grants, contracts, procurement. I mean, I don't have a strong view on that. We shall have to see. But I think wherever you're sort of adding, I think actually in a way your question comes into the sort of slightly red tape thing as well. The more hoops that you require charities to jump through, the more complicated it makes it, and the more open to accusations of sort of lack of objective decision making, I think you lay yourself open to. And can I just answer that question as well on the cutting red tape and tax? I mean, the arguments you make are the same basically for business as well as charities, and particularly for smaller businesses and smaller charities just because of the impact of these decisions. Yeah, absolutely, a Conservative government should always be, or a future Conservative government should always be about cutting red tape where it can and being assertive in that, and reducing the tax burden and being assertive about that. So yeah, absolutely, and that's going back to where, why Conservatives are good for charities. Well, they're for the same reason they're good for businesses in your scenario, in your example.
Lindsay, any other thoughts on how you might cut red tape and the tax burden on charities?
I definitely agree in terms of what was touched on around NI contributions. And I should have mentioned in my reserves answer that we used our reserves to cover a 124,000 bill that arrived all of a sudden with that NI contribution increase. I think ultimately looking at the charity, if government of any colour values civil society and the contribution of charities, they should think of it in a way that enables and empowers that. And I think there are, internationally, other countries that do more to empower and unlock philanthropy and charitable giving, and a lot of that is through, examples that Nick gave, whether it's around gift aid, etc., but also the language and the narrative around giving and celebrating individuals who do donate. But I think, as someone who is currently carrying all of the signatories for our bank, because we have appointed a new Director of Finance and Technology, and if anyone has a direct line to NatWest that could help me get a bank account, that would be brilliant. So I echo your frustration and agree. A lot could be done to save charitable funds and charities having to grow in ways that don't deliver impact through government guidance and deregulation.
Great, thank you. And Nick, to Abigail's point, you're talking about the sort of holistic support available to the deaf community and the critical role that small charities often play, providing that more personalised support. Now, I can see through your kind of long list here of organisations that you support, a lot of them are well-known big charities. So what more can we be doing to support smaller charities, as Abigail indicated?
Yeah, fundamentally, it is one of funding diversity. And as sort of said, we now offer, Postcode Lottery offer this multi-year unrestricted funding offer. But it also plays into the other point that's being made, and that is that government should be trying to make it easier for the charity sector and for the fundraising sector, and actually for private philanthropists as well, to make it easier for them to give money, to increase the diversity. And it sounds like a political point, and it's not, but the data shows if you look at private philanthropy from individuals, the number of very wealthy individuals in this country is going down because people are leaving. And people think, okay, that's great. But then if you actually look at what it does to the private donor base, and there are charities and trusts in this country that actually exist to link private donors with grassroots good causes, perhaps in the town that they came from, because they came from a working class mining town in the north of England and haven't lived there for 20 years, have been phenomenally successful. They want to give back and they don't know how. There are a raft of proposals out there as to how the government, at very little or actually at no cost, could better harness the power of private philanthropy. I think I've made the point in terms of lottery deregulation, but fundamentally it's about diversity of income stream. And it really requires the department to DCMS not to focus too much on on football and the BBC, but actually, if the department isn't willing to give the charity sector the priority that it deserves, it should be given to another department, because it is a huge and important area that actually cuts across every department in Whitehall.
Great, thank you, Nick. We've got time. Time is running out, but we've got time for some final questions, but they need to be one-sentence questions without embedded clauses. They need to be, so really think about this. So let's start with this gentleman at the back, and then we'll come to this lady here.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I'm interested if the panel have any views on the role of the Charity Commission within the conversation that we've been having today.
Great, and just tell people who you are. So it's
Sam Grant from Liberty.
Great, thank you. And then to this lady here, to Natasha.
Thanks. Natasha Porter from Unlocked Graduates. We are a large prison charity. Over time, we're seeing government contracts drifting from partnership contracts into outsourcing, and that really preferences the outsourcing companies over charities that are often kind of the expertise and best at specialist delivery. How do we create a culture in civil service procurement that prioritises quality over process and doesn't end up just with big outsourcing companies getting all of the contracts, which feels like where we're moving to?
Great. A few embedded clauses, but I'll allow that. Right. Let's. Who else was this lady here and this gentleman here? Yeah. Final questions. Please be brief with your questions.
I work for Better Society Capital, which used to be Big Society Capital, as you know, I've worked there for a few years, and I know it's an embedded clause, but the question is, I definitely find it leverage, and I'm probably one of the only Conservatives in the organisation, or open Conservatives, and I really do feel that as a party, the Conservative Party needs to maybe work more and give a better impression to the third sector, because I think that we are far more concerned about the vulnerable and using money properly and doing the right thing than the sector thinks often. That's my personal view.
Okay, thank you. And then this gentleman here.
Matthew van Dijkbode for co-CEO at Trussell, the food bank charity. Thank you very much for all your contributions. My question is just really about additionality and the distinctiveness of approach from the charity sector and what that can bring, particularly in this relationship with government. And not to be unfair on Lindsay, because you presented really, really well, I'm interested as to whether if government successfully rolls out all of the free school meals plans, do you still think actually there is something special about approaching your work with the kind of additionality that coming from a charity background brings rather than a state background?
Okay, great questions. So I'm going to start, please, with Nick. Perhaps you might touch a little bit about the sort of Conservatives in the civic sector. You've come out as a Conservative during this panel, so I think that's fine. And then the procurement point that Natasha was talking about, where you're prioritising quality.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it falls back on sort of lazy stereotypes and assumptions. Just assume that the charity sector is rife with left-wing bias. In my 5 years working for a funder and dealing with a huge range of charities, everyone has their views, and everyone comes at this from somewhere on the political spectrum. What I would say in terms of the charity sector, by which I mean specifically to those running Britain's charities, is that they may have their personal view, but fundamentally they just want a government that listens and a government that acts. And again, going back to the Big Society, the Civil Society Covenant, whatever the one was in the middle, there's a lot of warm words, but words are cheap. And actions are slightly more costly, and successively I think there's a feeling that the governments just don't take the sector seriously. What was the second point?
Natasha's point about procurement and prioritising quality in it, so over scale basically in terms of the types of organisations that are awarded grants.
Look, fundamentally I think that a lot of our charities do service provision. Not all of them do, and there's definitely a role for charity service provision. But the government also has to understand that sometimes just because they can deliver a project at scale doesn't mean that charities are able to respond and be as nimble and engage with the process in the same way that a hugely well-funded, massive commercial business would. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't do the service provision piece just as well. So sometimes it's about a tailored approach, I think, and fundamentally comes back to diversity. Someone made a point, about the Charity Commission, and the same principle applies whether it's procurement or whether it's an organisation or body like the Charity Commission. Just because it has existed and it has been a certain way doesn't mean that it should remain so. everything should always be on the table and subject to rigorous scrutiny and questioning as to how they could do things better as technology evolves, as demand evolves. And I don't think as a country we're particularly good at that, to be honest.
Lindsay, this sort of issue around additionality, but you might want to talk to the procurement point as well.
Yes, I think in some ways they actually come together in a way, because I think on the procurement point, what I would love to see more of is, obviously a focus on quality, but actually a focus on impact. And then what you would get is quality. Instead of, looking for kind of the number of outputs, it would be what's the difference you're trying to achieve? And then stepping back from that, if you're clear on what difference and impact you want to make, and you enable more flexibility in the procurement, in the contract, to deliver toward that, which is what charities are bloody brilliant at doing, because we're always trying to figure out how to achieve impact, how to make a difference with, limited resources. And I think that is that point around additionality. And one of the things we've been very conscious of is, has happened, I suppose, or is going to happen in our space, is the fact that we're moving from a place and time where all primary schools providing free universal access to breakfast provision through Magic Breakfast or Greggs or Kellogg's, any other charitable provision, have chosen to do that. And that's, to some extent, the power of the charity sector, is that people choose. There's an almost vocational aspect to working in the charity sector for a lot of people, which brings real passion and a sense of collective purpose. And so what we're currently thinking about is, as food is provided to schools, how does Magic Breakfast define and protect the magic around that bowl or plate of food? And I know that, because I've spoken to Emma, so as a shout out, Trussell is an absolute amazing organisation for not perpetuating a problem, genuinely looking to put itself out of business. And I know you think about that, importance of the cup of tea and that experience. And I think that is something that, again, the charity sector just gets intrinsically, the fact that it's people, human beings, connection. You could have a plate of the most nutritious food sat in a corner, but if a child isn't welcomed and doesn't feel a little bit of love and care and magic when they get to eat that, it won't have the same impact as a Magic Breakfast has. So, yes, definitely thinking about our additionality.
Very good. And then, Joe, perhaps particularly interested in the role of the Charity Commission, what your view is on that.
Yeah, that's the question I didn't want you to ask me.
You can answer a different question then if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be sort of overly critical, but there's some aspects of the way the Charity Commission operate that I think could be improved on and strengthened, and I'll leave it in that very, very bland, in those bland terms. What I will address is the question I wanted to, which is the sort of politics, the sense of sort of being left-wing within charities. I mean, look, I work for a charity that operated in health, so you would think sort of double whammy, and I'm happy to say I never sort of detected any sense of sort of left-wing sort of bias or views within that charity. That's just my experience of one.
Rather than the left-wing, more how the Conservatives can be more popular within the sector.
No, I agree, and that's my point, is we shouldn't be shy from engaging better with charities. I suspect after the first year of the Labour government, charities are a little less optimistic about the future under a Labour government based on the previous year. But look, a lot of the reasons that charities deliver so well and have such amazing expertise is because they have to operate in that business type way of being really careful about the money they spend. Unless they've got a magic sort of government funding stream that's going to last forever, actually they have to be really careful and plan ahead, not knowing where the next pennies are going to come from, and be innovative in the way they fundraise. These are all business type principles, core Conservative principles. They're actually the alternative, in many ways, the opposite of left-wing, state, top-down, there's more money on the magic money tree as long as it comes through the Treasury because it's the government's money, not the people's money, etc. So actually charities are a great example of Conservative principles, business principles in many ways, delivering services. So we should absolutely own that space.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the discussion. A big thank you to People's Postcode Lottery for the partnership, both intellectual and financial. Just to say, if you are interested in the next event that we're having, it's on the right road, how conservatism can be popular and effective again. And that's on at 6, and we have a drinks reception afterwards. Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, and Jesse Norman, the Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, are speaking at that. And it follows from a report that we did on the future of the European centre-right, which you can find on our website. If you're interested in a very good not-for-profit organisation, not a charity, but a very good not-for-profit organisation becoming a member, you can sign up to Bright Blue for as little as £10 if you're a student or older age, or £20 if you're not fitting into one of those categories. And you get all sorts of benefits, including members-only events and publications. So please sign up on our website for that. A big final round of applause, please, to all of our speakers. Thank you. And just to say that we, if you'd like, we'd spend 15-20 minutes in the room now, networking amongst ourselves, carrying on the conversation. So feel free to stay if you would like. But if you've got somewhere else to go, you can go there too as well.